Good evening and welcome to The Proof Is Out There. At almost 5 miles per second, the International Space Station makes one orbit around Earth in a little over 90 minutes. And you can bet it manages to photograph some pretty cool things and some pretty strange ones. Check this out. It's July 12th, 2021, and a live video streams from an external high-definition camera on the International Space Station when the camera captures something that's out of this world. It's a cluster of lights passing through its field, appearing to have a form similar to a constellation. Look at how they move at a seemingly controlled pace, holding their formation. To journalist Alexis Brooks, that's noteworthy.
This has eluded everybody. The fact that they moved so intentionally across the sky, you have to ask yourself, is there intelligent life behind what we're seeing? If these are intelligent objects, why would they be interested in the ISS? It could very well be that they are interested in us seeing them because maybe they want to expose themselves.
Brooks says that since its inception in the late 90s, the International Space Station has photographed many instances of mysterious lights that suggest the presence of extraterrestrial life.
The ISS is no stranger to capturing this sort of anomalous footage. In 2019, it captured several blue lights and a blue jet that launched out of a cloud and into space over the Pacific Ocean. And then in 2020, a Russian cosmonaut was filming the aurora, but something that he did not expect was what seemed to be a stream of horizontal lights. He called them space guests.
It's an interesting thought that the first extraterrestrial contact would be a subtle tickle rather than a bold arrival, that maybe these lights are just another in a series of gentle attempts to establish contact. But let's ask our experts before we spend too much time prepping our response. First, we turn to Rich Hoffman to determine could these lights be explained away as stars.
The lights are pretty much just little dots moving across the screen that are not changing size or position, and they look like that they're in some sort of a formation. But I have not seen anything where you have stars that move across the sky like that in that kind of a pattern. So they're not any stars.
While stars do move, they're so far away that this movement wouldn't be visible to the naked eye or this camera. And while there are other celestial bodies that visibly move, they don't do it in coordination like we see here.
They're not any planets. They're not a swarm of meteors that are coming toward the planet.
As for UFOs, Hoffman points out that the U.S. has always kept a close eye on any object entering the Earth's atmosphere. In fact, a 1971 treaty obligates the U.S. and Russia to notify each other of any unidentified objects coming from space. That's to prevent one from being mistaken for a nuclear missile attack.
I don't believe that UFOs in that kind of a swarm would have gone unnoticed by NASA. We can see something down to the size of a wrench, and we're doing that to be able to protect the actual space crew aboard the ISS. So people who are monitoring on Earth would have been able to readily point that out.
For Tim McMillan, it's the speed of the lights that becomes an important clue, telling him the camera isn't pointing toward the stars, but down.
The speed in which we see these lights move is consistent with the speed in which the ISS orbits the Earth. So that gives us a really good idea that we're looking at something that's fixed on the Earth.
Then could these lights be part of Earth's atmosphere, say weather?
Even though it's 248 miles above the Earth's surface, we often see natural phenomena, lightning strikes, that type of thing. However, because these lights are static, I think we can rule out lightning.
If it's not atmospheric, could they be city lights?
These really don't look like what we see with major cities from space. You can see the sprawling spider web of network of roads and buildings, but we don't see that here.
So what does that leave us? Mark D'Antonio has an idea.
Where I've seen lights like this on Earth is when there have been fishing fleets offshore using bright lights aimed down into the water to lure shrimp. And so that's probably what we're seeing here.
It also explains the darkness that surrounds all the lights. That's the ocean.
These larger bloated areas are where the lights are being cast out in a very broad area. Water reflects light very well. And so you can actually see these lights from the International Space Station.
Our verdict? Fishing vessels. We think D'Antonio's comparison between this video and other known vessels is a match. If you want to see views from the ISS for yourself, you can visit the ISS HD Earth viewing experiment online. To date, approximately 500 million people have seen the globe this way. Now, from fishing boats to kayaks. Most people take up kayaking as a way to escape, bask in nature, and relax. But just going with the flow was not an option for the guys who had this intense and unusual aquatic encounter. June 29th, 2017. On Yale Lake in southwest Washington. Two men take their kayaks out for a relaxing afternoon when the calm waters are suddenly disturbed.
Weird.
The video seems to show bubbles rising to the surface of the water in the center of the lake as the kayakers paddle towards them.
Just bubbles coming from the bottom of the lake. No current. I'm afraid to put my hand in the water.
One kayaker dips his camera below the waterline, and we see debris and thousands of bubbles swirling.
Weird though, dude.
The bubbling is so intense, the other kayaker panics and paddles off.
Go, go, go.
Then an ominous burst of murky brown water erupts as hundreds of leaves are belched up to the surface.
What the f? What the f just happened? Something just happened that we caught on camera. Dude, it stinks.
Field researcher and author Ken Gerhardt tries to help us understand what we're seeing in the video.
My first thoughts are, is there something alive beneath the water that's creating these bubbles and this disturbance in the water? Yale Lake is connected to the Columbia River, which has been said to be home to this massive creature called colossal clod. Sightings date back to the early 1930s. The general physical description is a huge animal, about 40 feet long, with a serpentine, although a very thick, powerful body, and what was described as a very evil, snaky head. Many of the lakes around the world where these monsters have been reported all boast healthy populations of salmon and trout. So perhaps these lake monsters might also live in the ocean and follow the salmon populations into fresh water to feed.
There are dozens, maybe thousands of undiscovered creatures inhabiting the world's lakes. Recently, researchers uncovered around 40 new species in Lake Imweru, located between Zambia and the Democratic Republic of Congo. But was whatever these kayakers saw a creature from the deep? Let's see what's swimming in our experts' thought bubbles. Marine biologist Dr. Shay Conger begins her analysis by addressing the lake monster theory.
The number of salmon in the Columbia River has dramatically decreased. And this is an important resource not only for humans, but for wildlife. So if there was some sort of abnormally large animal in Yale Lake, it probably wouldn't have a lot of food to live off of. And so it's pretty unlikely that there are undiscovered large animals in Yale Lake. There are actually a couple of freshwater seal populations in the world. But if this were something like a seal or a whale, we would definitely see the animal itself. And seals really only hold their breath for maybe 20 minutes at a time.
What about those bubbles? Geologist Bob Anderson helps us figure out what could be happening here.
Natural gas and oil are formed between sedimentary layers. And you get a lot of carboniferous materials that are from the time before the dinosaurs. And these areas get buried deep down. And that pressure and heat causes those organic materials to break down into hydrocarbons. And all it takes is a crack in the rock, and they just release and they pop real fast.
The Carboniferous period occurred 300 million years ago. So these organic materials have been building pressure for quite some time, just waiting to blow.
When you look at the video and you add in the combination of those bubbles and the smell at the end.
Dude, it stinks.
To me, it's a dead clue that it's some type of a natural gas that's coming up.
This happens all over the world. Massive underwater craters have been discovered off the coast of Norway, up to 147 feet deep and 2,624 feet wide. Researchers have deemed them the cause of expulsions of gas rising to the surface in the area. Our verdict? Natural gas. The smell was the clincher. The kayaker complained about the horrible aroma, which is a common attribute of methane gas when it mixes with hydrogen sulfide, causing a rotten egg odor. While the men didn't come across colossal Claude, they did still stumble upon a remarkable piece of natural history. This next story is about a sound that was heard over thousands of square miles, and yet no one could see what caused it. Did it come from the ground, the sky, or the U.S. government? October 2021, it's a quiet fall morning in Leominster, Massachusetts. But shortly before 11:30 a.m., that tranquil scene is broken when a backyard security camera captures this mysterious sound. No big deal, right? That boom is almost immediately followed by a softer one, except neither is soft. The sound is heard over 3 states, which means wherever it emanated from, it was as loud as a 100 megaton nuclear explosion.
First thing that jumped to my mind was maybe it was like a meteor or an explosion close by, some demolition on something. But it can't be proven to be something rational. There's plenty of things out in this universe that we don't know about.
So what could it be? According to journalist MJ Banias, there are several theories.
The idea is much like the Earth can fracture and create an earthquake, frequencies in the sky will also rub up against each other and create a loud boom sound. Some people believe it's caused by storms or it's caused by electromagnetic frequencies. Some people believe it's caused by the Earth's magnetic poles.
But not everyone agrees skyquakes are the work of Mother Nature.
Other people believe that when UFOs enter our atmosphere, they create a skyquake of sorts. Because they would create a loud boom sound, much like a fighter jet when it goes hypersonic.
Between 2013 and 2015, scientists from the University of North Carolina attempted to determine the origins of skyquakes with a mobile network of 400 atmospheric sensors and seismographs. And while no definitive answers were found, the research did rule out the possibility that seismic activity plays any role in these strange sounds. So what do we have here? A meteor? A sonic boom from a jet? Some other natural or supernatural explanation? We asked our experts to take a listen. We begin our analysis with meteorologist Juan Hernandez. Could this boom have been caused by a meteor? Turns out that satellites set up for tracking lightning strikes have the answer.
A result of tracking lightning is oftentimes the ability to detect meteors streaking across the sky. In this case, we did have an example detected in the sky across New Hampshire. The satellite itself picked up the flash at 11:21 in the morning. That sound was heard across the region.
But while radar detection on a scope appears to be definitive visual evidence of a meteor, soundscape ecologist Ben Gottesman says the audio captured on the backyard camera tells another story.
Skyquakes refer to low-frequency rumbling, and they typically occur not when it's storming, but on nice, calm days.
But Gottesman says while no one really knows what causes them, what he hears can be explained.
That double boom signature is really characteristic of sonic booms that eclipse the speed of sound. The question is, was it a sonic boom produced by an aircraft or a meteor?
Gottesman analyzes known examples of the sounds produced by both objects. First up, the boom of a meteor.
So that is a sonic boom caused by a meteor ripping through the atmosphere, and it's characterized by this single impulse that we see here.
Next up, an example of a boom from a fighter jet.
Here we're going to listen to a sonic boom caused by an aircraft. Did you hear that double boom? Aircraft have this double boom sound because there's a sonic boom created at the front and at the tail end of the aircraft, as both of them eclipse the speed of sound, which is around 750 miles per hour. Those pressure waves collide together and produce these shock waves that then ripple through and create these booms. And we'll compare that to this. To me, it's a really good match. This sound really does have the shape and profile of sonic booms created by an aircraft.
So if you believe our experts, this is one of the oddest phenomena we've ever covered. The meteorological data indicates a meteor was entering the atmosphere, and the audio analysis indicates military jets were passing over at the same time. What are the odds of that? One of those events probably explains the sound. But our verdict? This is an unexplained coincidence. Seriously. Have you ever wondered why the Mouse King and the Nutcracker is sometimes depicted with more than one head? Turns out it's based on a real phenomenon. And after seeing this next video, I'm glad I've only ever viewed it on a stage. Tartu, Estonia, October 2021. Johan Uibapu receives a disturbing phone call from his mother regarding her chicken coop. He offers to take a look, but nothing could prepare him for what he finds.
Oh boy, their tail is really tangled.
That's an understatement. Let's take another look. What looks like a heap of black rats is actually a heap of black rats with their tails hopelessly entangled together. There are 13 rats in this bundle bound together for life.
One of them, unfortunately, looks like it has passed on to the next world. And maybe that's for the best. I wouldn't want to be tied to a bunch of my brothers and sisters either.
Would you believe that this isn't the first time a knot of rats like this has been discovered? It's even got a name, the Rat King.
The term Rat King is thought to originate from German. It's a number of rats whose tails have become entangled so that they are basically like a rodent superorganism. An older, wiser rat would sit atop a pile of younger rats, and they would serve all of his needs. Unfortunately for rat kings, they are considered to be bad omens. It's thought that they warn of the plague. They're also associated with witchcraft.
Because of this, in old Strasbourg, where rat kings were found, they were usually drowned in a well or dunked in boiling water before being brought to the local school teacher to study them. Because of their supernatural associations and the rarity of their occurrences, there's debate as to whether or not rat kings are cruel man-made hoaxes.
There is a long history of fabricating creatures for profit. Think about P.T. Barnum's Fiji Mermaid, George Hull's Cardiff Giant. Back in the day, people would take lizards and glue bat wings on them and say, here, buy a dragon. Or they'd stick a narwhal horn on a horse and say, this is a unicorn. So a hoax is definitely not outside the realm of possibility.
Knots are complicated. There's a whole area of mathematics called knot theory, dedicated to studying these things in the abstract. And the knots of the Rat King tales are complex too. Scientists have attempted to recreate them, and they quickly discovered it was a lot harder than expected. The knots they made looked too neat and intentional, and those rats were dead. Let's turn to our experts to see what they think about this whole thing. First, we turn to biologist Floyd Hayes to find out, is this real? And if so, how the heck does something like this happen?
One possibility is that it was faked and somebody actually stuck the tails together. But it could also be a natural phenomenon, and I think that's most likely in this case. It's been suggested that perhaps they are stuck together from birth, but that seems very unlikely because these are fairly well grown and they would likely starve to death if they were stuck together for a few weeks.
So if they weren't destined at birth to become parts of a rat king, how do they form?
So a rat king occurs when the tails are stuck together. This usually happens in black rats, which have unusually long tails compared to other species of rats. And it happens mostly in cold countries during the winter months. And it is believed that their tails are frozen together overnight when they're huddling together for warmth by water or urine or sperm or food.
However, in a bizarre twist, when we do some research of our own, we find that temperatures in this area of Estonia only had a low of 36 degrees Fahrenheit the night before this rat king was found. Not cold enough to freeze. And what's more, rats, contrary to their reputation, groom themselves nearly as much as cats. The idea that they could get stuck together with dirt and grime seems unlikely. So we turn to wildlife biologist Stephanie Shuttler. She says the Rat King legend carries a grain of truth.
Rats can be carriers of diseases and parasites. So the fact that people thought rat kings were bad omens or carriers or signals of plague, it's not that unreasonable of a leap.
It might just be coincidence, but the COVID-19 epidemic was still ravaging Europe when this video was shot. And Shuttler says there's another question gnawing at her. Why do these rats lie down and accept their fates? Why don't they fight back?
When animals are stuck or trying to escape from something, they can do things like chew their own appendage off. Like this has happened in leg traps with animals like coyotes or wolves. Why aren't these rats chewing their own tails off to get away?
Our verdict? It seems like rat kings form naturally. But what we don't know is the why of it all. Why aren't there more rat kings? And why don't these rats make more of an effort to escape? It remains an unexplained mystery. The great Jim Morrison once advised all motorists to keep your eyes on the road and your hands up on the wheel. But that's easier said than done when what's coming at you on the highway is breaking on through the doors of perception. It's a November night in 2019, and long-haul trucker James Cole is passing through Stevensville, Wisconsin. After hours of playing highway, he comes around a turn and sees this.
Man, what's with that purple in the sky?
A fuchsia light glows over the road, a stark contrast to the dark night sky.
It's kind of trippy, huh? Purple lights in the sky.
And it doesn't go away either. As James drives, it appears to get bigger and closer.
I was talking on the CB radio as I was passing other trucks to say, man, do you guys see this? What is this thing? What is that? No one was calling back, but it's most unusual.
James is perplexed by why his shout-outs to his fellow truckers are met with radio silence.
I had posted it to my YouTube channel. It got an uproar, but no one could really pinpoint exactly what it was, and I couldn't either.
So imagine you're the driver in this truck. You glance up to the skies and you see this. The first thing you notice, obviously, is the color. It's pink. And then you notice the shape, right? Not a sunset that I've ever seen. Not something tied to the aurora borealis. Not a beacon of any kind. This driver continued on his journey for miles. It never left the sky. It didn't appear to move. If I saw this on the road, I'd be pretty freaked out. Author Amy Teitel says the theories varied.
One of the leading theories was that this pink cloud is evidence of chemtrails. Chemtrails are a theory that the government is releasing toxic chemicals into the atmosphere by plane for a variety of reasons, ranging from mind control to weather control. Another theory is that this pink cloud is some kind of electromagnetic field or radiation, which is reminiscent of the famous Zona de Silencio in Mexico. This is a region in the Mapimi Desert where allegedly no cell phone or radio signals can get through. It is a complete dead silence zone.
An electromagnetic field is a force field produced by stationary electrical charges being combined with moving magnetic currents. This force could become entangled with CB radio waves, throwing off their signal or causing them to stop completely. Perhaps this is why James's CB radio couldn't reach anyone. What else could be at play here? Rumors about La Zona del Silencio began in 1970 when a U.S. military base fired a test missile toward the White Sand Missile Range, and the rocket ended up in the Mapimi Desert 400 miles south of its target. This secret operation remains a mystery. Could similar forces be at play in Wisconsin? Hopefully our experts can hit the mark. First, we turn to meteorologist Juan Hernandez. Could this be evidence of the fabled chemtrail?
We have actually 2 satellites that cover the whole Western Hemisphere. We would be able to detect there was some sort of chemical being released into the atmosphere. In reality, what people call chemtrails are actually water vapor from the engines of the airplane, usually in a line. In this case, we don't have a line. It's more like a circular or a blob of light.
But what does he think about this being some sort of electromagnetic event? Physicist Matthew Shadagis weighs in.
I do find it intriguing that the truck driver claims to be unable to contact others because that would hint towards something electromagnetic in nature, but that doesn't necessarily correspond with a light in the sky. There are many different ways to create dead zones with cellular signals, but they're not going to produce a visible effect that you can see in the sky.
So what are we looking at?
I looked at the exit sign, where in Wisconsin this video took place, and it turns out that very nearby, there is an organization that runs an aquaponics facility that uses purple LEDs to grow their plants.
Aquaponics is a food production system that combines aquaculture of fish with hydroponics of plants. Nutrient-rich water and proper lighting for photosynthesis are key. So that kind of fits what James saw, but he started recording that footage miles away. So how could James see this from such a long distance?
Colors that are towards the end of the rainbow tend to scatter more easily in the atmosphere. That could explain why we see such a large purple mass in this video, because the lights from the LumaGrow LEDs can really scatter very easily through the atmosphere and create an eerie paranormal glow. The clouds could be reflecting light or refracting, which means bending the light, making it look much larger than it actually is. But it's just some botanists growing some plants and vegetation for us.
So it looks like we've solved this one, at least partly. We don't know why the radio went silent, but the strange purple light was coming from an aquaponic farm. Who knows, maybe James will find himself transporting some of the produce being grown there to a store near you. In the meantime, brother, keep on trucking. We love nothing more than featuring stories submitted by our dedicated viewers. So here's a doozy. Now, the majority of UFO videos we investigate are usually due to the fact someone just happened to be at the right place at the right time and press record. But you're about to meet a man who desperately wanted to get a UFO on video. And it turns out, maybe he did. We're in Ardmore, Oklahoma for this one with dedicated proof viewer Joey Franco. After witnessing what he thinks is a UFO one night above his home, Joey makes it his mission to scan the evening sky each night with his thermal camera for any other signs of extraterrestrial life. And on May 26, 2017, he records this.
Definitely a disc.
Take a closer look. Watch how the object appears to hover near the clouds, then deliberately it moves sideways. Then, Joey points a laser directly at it.
Whoa, did you see it stop? If I wouldn't have shined a laser at it, it would have never came back. It's almost right over the top of me now. I hope it don't hurt me. Please don't hurt me. I've made contact with this thing. I hope I don't get taken tonight, man.
I'm like scared and excited all at the same time. It's like I never expected this to happen this night, to make contact with aliens.
Whoa, did you see that? It's gone, man. At 1,000 miles an hour, this thing booked.
Even journalist Aaron McCarthy wonders if it's possible Joey actually made contact with an alien ship.
It almost seems like there's a bit of an empathetic connection between Joey and whatever this craft is. He's talking to the craft.
It's coming right back at me, man. Isn't that amazing?
And it seems to be responding to him.
The idea of humans communicating with extraterrestrials goes back hundreds, if not thousands of years. Some theorize the Nazca people of Peru communicated with alien civilizations, and that some of the mysterious 1,200-foot designs they built were actually spaceship runways. And 3,000-year-old artifacts unearthed at Songqingdui, China, first in the 1920s and then in the 80s, have convinced many of alien contact in our past. But in the 20th century, others attempted to use the power of the mind.
There was actually a man after World War II named George Van Tassel who believed that he could summon and telepathically communicate with aliens by meditating. And they actually telepathically gave him instructions to build a structure out in the desert that was supposed to reverse the aging process.
In the 1950s, author and UFO contactee George Van Tassel brought together 11,000 people for his interplanetary spacecraft convention in the California desert, hoping to make contact. But was Joey able to communicate with aliens all by himself? We sent his footage to our experts to decide. We begin with Rich Hoffman of the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. Does Joey's use of a thermal camera offer any clues?
Could it be a plane? No, it doesn't have wings to help hold it up. We don't see any heat coming out of the back end of it, which might be expelled from the heat from whatever the propulsion system was. So I don't put it in any kind of a category like an aircraft.
Astronomer and video effects designer Mark D'Antonio agrees this isn't an airplane. And he says a drone wouldn't move as erratically as this. But D'Antonio believes that sudden movement may be a key piece of the puzzle.
Whoa, did you see that?
You're watching it move through the sky, and then all of a sudden, it's going to go right down to the ground. So the way it's flying right now, it kind of looks like a hawk. If you have to try to assign it to something, it most resembles a bird of prey.
Is D'Antonio right? Is this a bird on the hunt for its next meal? Science writer Mick West agrees the thermal camera does offer a clue.
All that we can tell about the temperature of this object is that it's warmer than everything else in the scene. It could very well be an animal.
So if it's an animal, what kind? West compares the object to a known creature that Joey also recorded.
Joey has this video here, which is a creature that he recognized as being a bat. And you can see the object flapping its wings. And if we take the two videos and put them side by side, you can see when it's more clearly something with wings, it's actually a bit larger. Even though you can't really see anything like wings flapping like that in the object, it's hard to say. I wouldn't rule out the possibility that this isn't a bat and this is a bat, but in both videos, it's kind of very difficult to see what's going on because of the low resolution.
So what do we have here? If we can't see any wings flapping, it's hard to say bat or bird of prey. Has it turned out Joey may have found exactly what he was looking for?
I think a lot of the time when people think they are summoning aliens, they're just getting lucky. Eventually something's going to fly along. But this is a UFO because it's unidentified and it's flying. I don't know what it is.
What the hell is it?
Could be a bat, could be a bird, could be something else.
I've made contact.
Our verdict? Genuine UFO. While this could be some sort of animal, we agree with the experts that the video doesn't give us a clear enough image to make that call with confidence. So it remains unidentified. But when Joey does find that definitive proof, we'll be here to show it. Here's a stone-cold mystery that's been millions of years in the making. A large, strange rock with patterns so precise, it looks like it has to be the product of intelligent design. Let's see if we have the intelligence to figure it out. It's July 2016 in Mineral County, West Virginia. A nature photographer is taking pictures around Jennings-Randolph Lake when she sees something mysterious and snaps a shot. Her photo shows a rock formation with an almost honeycomb appearance on its face, like a stone beehive. The pattern is geometrical with straight rows of triangles and rhombuses, which make it look somewhat like a waffle. It's darker in color than the rock face and appears in relief, which makes it stand out. And journalist Eric Grundhauser confirms that it often draws curious visitors.
What makes it so evocative is the way that the shapes here and the design on the rock are so seemingly uniform. When we see natural formations, we often think of them as a little bit more random, a little bit more chaotic. But the design on Waffle Rock seems to be a bit more ordered. It seems to have a reason to it.
So it looks like the rock isn't random. And Grundhauser wonders if it's trying to tell us something.
One theory is that it is a design created by an ancient culture that was trying to leave some sort of message or hieroglyphic and left it in this indecipherable code.
If that were the case, it would have been chiseled into the rock. We know that ancient Native Americans in what is now western North Carolina etched this curvilinear motif into a soapstone boulder known as Judah-Kula Rock more than 2,000 years ago. It is considered a mystical site to many Cherokee, but there's an even more ancient possibility.
Another theory is that this is actually the fossilized imprint of the skin of some kind of giant lizard left behind in the stone.
Specifically, some have speculated that it's the fossilized or even mummified remains of a dinosaur. Sound far-fetched? Well, look at this. This is the perfectly preserved mummy of a Nodosaurus dinosaur found by miners in Alberta, Canada in 2011. It got this way because it sank into the muck shortly after it died, preserving its skin and armor. Yet Grunhauser has one more idea about the rock's origin.
Still another theory posits that it was created by extraterrestrials, either created intentionally as some kind of map for other extraterrestrials or to mark their passing.
So, could this be the work of intelligent alien design? Though the Waffle Rock Formation is not at all common. Similar pattern stones have been found in Monongahela, Pennsylvania, and at Tea Creek Mountain in West Virginia. Still, this one in Mineral County is by far the largest. So what are these bizarre boulders and where do they come from? Let's turn to the experts. Anthropologist Kathy Strain considers if this could be an ancient artwork.
I'm not seeing anything typical of what you would see with Native American rock art. It's not a typical design. It doesn't have any kind of structure that a Native American would want to convey.
Perhaps then this is ancient writing, maybe even from a lost language? Archaeologist Dr. Ed Barnhart is an epigrapher who translates cuneiform, hieroglyphics, and unknown ancient scripts. He gives the strange pattern a look.
This waffle rock doesn't follow any of the rules of making something that's communicating a message in stone. The reader and the writer have to agree on a set amount of symbols, or it doesn't work as a code. When you look at waffle rock, there is no pattern. It is very complex and very geometric. There's lots of lines, but there's no repeated or different symbols.
If we can rule out man-made origins, what about the idea that this is fossilized skin or scales from an ancient creature like a dinosaur?
A fossil is simply the calcium in bone being replaced with rock through millions of years of being covered with mud. When I look at it, I don't see any fossilization at all. There's nothing there that would indicate calcium, like a bone structure, or any organics at all.
We turn next to geologist Bob Anderson. Perhaps Earth science might offer some guidance here. Could this be some sort of natural geological formation?
You'll see that there are multiple what we call joint patterns here. And what happens is that these are fluids that are running through this rock. Either iron fluids or water fluids, even magma, was running through these cracks in the rocks, and it hardened and eroded away at a different pace. And so you see what's called a waffle pattern. And this is natural. We see it in all kinds of crystals.
Anderson says the movement of tectonic plates caused cracks in the sandstone that likely filled with iron oxide, mixed with sand, and formed a hard cement-like material resistant to weathering compared to the surrounding stone. As the surrounding rock gradually eroded, it left behind the iron oxide pattern. Our verdict? This is a natural phenomenon, likely caused by iron oxide flowing into a crack in the rock and hardening into the...
In the beginning, before the footage was slowed down, stabilized, color-corrected, annotated, debated, and finally devoured by millions of curious eyes across glowing screens, there was only a quiet transmission drifting down from low Earth orbit, a routine data stream from the International Space Station that no one was supposed to linger on. Because the modern world runs on the assumption that everything important announces itself loudly, with press releases and headlines and official seals. Not with a handful of anomalous pixels moving against the blackness of space. Yet this assumption has always been fragile, and it cracked a little more the night an amateur analyst noticed something wrong, or rather something alive, in the footage recorded during what should have been a dull orbital pass over the Pacific, a pass logged, archived, and almost forgotten until those shapes appeared, small at first, then unmistakably numerous, clustering and dispersing in ways that mocked both. Debris models and conventional physics, behaving less like trash and more like a swarm, a word that carries biological weight, intention, coordination, a word that once spoken cannot easily be taken back. The proof is out there as a television series thrives on this precise moment of rupture, when the ordinary fractures and lets the impossible seep through, And in this case, the ISS UFO swarm became not merely a clip but a narrative seed, because swarms imply patterns, and patterns imply intelligence, and intelligence, when observed in places it should not exist, forces the human mind into a corner where disbelief and fascination wrestle without resolution. The first analysis tried to calm the storm by invoking ice crystals, vented coolant, or reflective fragments released during routine maneuvers, yet the footage resisted simplification because the objects accelerated and decelerated in tight formation, some darting away while others lingered, rejoining as if responding to signals invisible to the camera, and it is here that the novelist's eye, trained to read subtext in motion and silence, notices the unease creeping into even the most cautious. Expert commentary, the slight hesitation before a sentence, the careful choice of words like unidentified and anomalous, terms that sound clinical but are emotionally charged precisely because they mark the border of knowledge. As the episode unfolds, the viewer is guided through layers of skepticism and possibility, but beneath the graphics and expert panels there runs an older story, one about humanity's discomfort with the idea that observation is a two-way act, that when we look out into the universe may also be looking back, not with malice or benevolence necessarily, but with curiosity, the same curiosity that drives us to send fragile habitats into orbit and populate them with soft, air-breathing organisms who stare out through reinforced glass, believing themselves to be explorers rather than exhibits. The ISS UFO swarm segment does something subtle and dangerous. It refuses to fully close the door, and that refusal echoes into the second mystery of the episode, the Yale Lake Leaf, a discovery so terrestrial and yet so strange that it mirrors the cosmic anomaly with unsettling symmetry, as if to suggest that the unknown does not only descend from the sky, but also rises quietly from the water beneath our feet. Yale Lake, a man-made reservoir in Washington state, is not a place that invites myth at first glance. It is engineered, measured, controlled, its shoreline familiar to anglers and hikers who trust in the stability of maps. But when a leaf-shaped object was pulled from its depths, massive, textured, and inexplicably detailed, the language of certainty faltered once again, because this was not merely a rock formation or a piece of driftwood, and yet it did not fit neatly into any known biological category either. The Proof is Out There treats this discovery with the same procedural respect it affords the orbital footage, measuring, comparing, contextualizing, and in doing so it reveals a thematic through-line that a novelist cannot ignore. The tension between classification and wonder, between the human need to label and the equally human thrill of encountering something that resists labels. The leaf, like the swarm, becomes a symbol, not in the overt, literary sense, but in the quieter, more unsettling way that real-world anomalies do, by sitting stubbornly at the edge of explanation and forcing us to confront the possibility that our taxonomies are incomplete, that there are chapters missing from the book of nature we like to pretend we have nearly finished reading. What fascinates me, as someone who builds long-form narratives from fragments of reality, is how the show's structure mirrors the investigative process itself, moving back and forth between data and doubt, expert testimony and speculative silence, never quite allowing the viewer to settle into comfort, because comfort would imply closure, and closure would be dishonest. The ISS UFO swarm segment, in particular, plays with scale in a way that destabilizes perception, reminding us that objects the size of cars can appear as pinpricks in space, while entities the size of leaves can carry the weight of ancient mysteries. And this inversion of expectation is where the storytelling becomes quietly radical, because it suggests that significance is not proportional to size or distance, but to the questions an object provokes. As the cameras zoom in on the footage, frame by frame, there is an almost ritualistic quality to the analysis, a modern form of divination where pixels replace entrails and spectrograms stand in for omens, and yet the emotional response is strikingly old, a mixture of awe and fear that our ancestors might have felt when confronted with unexplained lights in the sky or strange forms emerging from rivers. A reminder that technology has changed the tools of inquiry, but not the fundamental human reaction to the unknown. The Proof is Out There does not sensationalize these reactions overtly, but it does not suppress them either, allowing moments of genuine surprise to linger just long enough to feel uncomfortable, as if to say that skepticism, while necessary, should not become a reflexive shield against curiosity. In weaving together the cosmic and the terrestrial, the episode titled ISS UFO Swarm, Yale Lake Leaf M, invites a deeper meditation on observation itself, on the limits of perspective imposed by our instruments and assumptions, and on the possibility that anomalies are not errors in the data, but messages we do not yet know how to read. As a novelist, I am drawn to the idea that stories like these function as modern myths, not because they provide answers, but because they encode questions in a form that can be shared, debated, and reinterpreted across cultures and generations, much like the myths of old encoded astronomical observations or environmental knowledge beneath layers of narrative. The ISS footage becomes a kind of sky myth, replayed and reanalyzed, while the Yale Lake Leaf becomes an Earth myth, passed from hand to hand, photographed, measured, and ultimately returned to the water of speculation, and in both cases the show resists the temptation to declare victory over mystery, choosing instead to document the process of inquiry as an ongoing, unfinished act. There is a quiet humility in this approach that stands in contrast to the louder certainties of other programs, and it is this humility that gives the episode its lingering power because it aligns more closely with the lived experience of science, where answers are provisional and every solution generates new questions. Watching the experts debate whether the swarm could be explained by known phenomena, or whether the leaf could be a product of unusual geological processes, one senses the boundaries of institutional knowledge pressing in, not as walls, but as horizons, always receding as we move toward them, and this sense of endless pursuit is what transforms a collection of anomalies into a narrative worthy of sustained attention. The title itself, truncated with an ellipsis, feels like a promise left intentionally unfulfilled, a grammatical acknowledgement that the story does not end here, that there are more mysteries waiting in the wings, more footage to be examined, more objects to be pulled from lakes and skies and mines, and in this way the episode becomes less a conclusion than an invitation. By the time the screen fades to black, the viewer is left not with a definitive answer, but with a sharpened awareness of uncertainty, a sense that the world is larger, stranger, and more intricately patterned than our daily routines allow us to notice, and that perhaps the proof we seek is not only out there, but also in our willingness to keep looking without demanding immediate resolution. This first part of the story, then, is not about aliens or artifacts or definitive explanations, but about the moment of encounter, the instant when the familiar falters and the unknown steps forward, asking not to be conquered, but to be acknowledged, studied, and, for now, left partially unexplained, because sometimes the most honest response to mystery is to admit that it exists, and to allow that admission to change the way we see both the sky above and the water below, knowing that every unanswered question is also a doorway, waiting patiently for someone brave or curious enough to step through. If part 1 lingered on the moment of encounter, then part 2 must inhabit the aftermath, that uneasy stretch of intellectual terrain where the mind refuses to return to normal proportions, because once an anomaly has been acknowledged, even provisionally, it begins to exert a gravitational pull on everything around it, drawing in memories, theories, cultural residues, and half-forgotten precedents. And this is precisely where the proof is out there deepens its quiet provocation by showing how a single unexplained event rarely exists in isolation, instead echoing outward into history, psychology, and institutional behavior. In the wake of the ISS UFO swarm footage, the conversation does not stay confined to orbital mechanics or camera artifacts, but expands into a broader examination of how modern observation systems are designed not only to capture data, but also to filter it, to prioritize what is deemed relevant and discard what does not fit established parameters, and this filtering process, while essential for managing overwhelming streams of information, carries within it an unspoken assumption that the unexpected is more likely to be noise than signal. Yet the swarm refuses to behave like noise, because noise does not organize itself, does not appear to respond to proximity or relative motion, and does not provoke such consistent patterns of reappearance across frames, and so the experts are forced into a delicate rhetorical dance, acknowledging the limits of current explanations without stepping fully into speculation. A dance that reveals more about the culture of modern science than any single conclusion ever could. What emerges is a portrait of expertise under pressure, not in the sensational sense of panic, but in the quieter, more revealing sense of caution, where every word is weighed against reputational risk, funding structures, and the invisible boundaries of acceptable discourse. As a novelist, I find this tension fertile ground because it exposes the human element beneath the lab coats and titles, reminding us that knowledge is produced by people operating within systems that reward certainty and punish ambiguity, even though ambiguity is often where the most interesting truths reside. The episode subtly underscores this by juxtaposing the ISS analysis with historical cases of aerial phenomena, not to argue equivalence, but to demonstrate recurrence, the unsettling realization that similar patterns have been observed before, cataloged, debated, and ultimately shelved, not because they were resolved, but because attention moved on. This historical layering transforms the swarm from a singular curiosity into part of a longer, unresolved conversation between humanity and the sky, a conversation punctuated by brief moments of clarity and long stretches of silence. Meanwhile, the Yale Lake leaf mystery undergoes its own expansion, shifting from the object itself to the environment that produced or preserved it, and here the show's narrative instincts shine, because water has always been a repository of the unknown, a medium that conceals as much as it reveals, and reservoirs like Yale Lake are particularly evocative because they are artificial yet ancient in feel, human-made structures that nonetheless reclaim the mystique of natural depths. The analysis of the leaf's composition, texture, and scale introduces a different kind of uncertainty, one rooted not in the vastness of space, but in the complexity of earthly processes, where biology, geology, and chemistry intersect in ways that defy simple categorization. Experts debate whether the object could be a fossilized plant, an unusual mineral formation, or an example of pareidolia amplified by expectation, and in doing so they reenact a familiar epistemological struggle, the effort to decide whether an anomaly demands a new category or can be forced, with sufficient ingenuity, into an existing one. What is striking is how the emotional charge of the debate mirrors that of the UFO discussion, suggesting that the discomfort of not knowing is scale invariant, equally potent whether the mystery floats above the atmosphere or rests at the bottom of a lake. The proof is out there does not explicitly link these reactions, but the parallel structure invites the viewer to make the connection, to see how the same cognitive patterns repeat across domains, revealing a deep-seated human impulse to stabilize reality through explanation, even when explanation remains elusive. As Part 2 unfolds, the narrative voice, understated but persistent, begins to hint at a more unsettling possibility that the true mystery may not lie in the objects themselves, but in the frameworks we use to interpret them, frameworks shaped by centuries of scientific success that have perhaps fostered an overconfidence in closure, an expectation that every question must yield to method if given enough time and data. Yet anomalies like the swarm and the leaf resist this expectation, not because they are inherently unknowable, but because they sit at the intersection of multiple explanatory regimes, none of which can claim exclusive authority. This resistance generates a kind of narrative pressure, a sense that something is being asked of the viewer beyond passive consumption, an invitation to tolerate uncertainty without immediately resolving it into belief or dismissal. In this way, the episode becomes a meditation on epistemic humility, a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge is not a straight line toward mastery, but a winding path marked by detours, dead ends, and moments of profound doubt. The ISS footage, revisited with new analytical tools, yields incremental insights but no definitive answers, while the Yale Lake leaf, subjected to increasingly sophisticated tests, remains stubbornly ambiguous, and this shared indeterminacy begins to feel less like a failure and more like a feature, an honest reflection of a universe that does not conform neatly to human categories. The show's restrained aesthetic reinforces this interpretation, avoiding dramatic music or exaggerated claims, allowing silence and careful phrasing to carry weight, and in doing so it trusts the viewer to engage at a deeper level, to recognize that mystery does not require embellishment to be compelling. From a literary perspective, Part 2 functions as the rising tension of a longer narrative arc, where questions multiply faster than answers, and the stakes shift subtly from the identification of objects to the interrogation of assumptions. The swarm becomes a lens through which we examine our relationship with surveillance and observation, while the leaf becomes a mirror reflecting our desire to find meaning in form, to read intention into structure, even when intention may be absent or simply inscrutable. Together, they suggest a world that is not fully transparent to human inquiry, a world that retains pockets of opacity despite our best efforts to illuminate it, and this suggestion carries a quiet ethical dimension, challenging the notion that everything must be known, categorized, and controlled. As the episode draws toward its midpoint, the viewer is left with a sense of suspension, as if standing on a threshold between explanation and wonder, aware that stepping fully into either would collapse the tension that gives the story its power. For the novelist, this is the sweet spot, the place where narrative energy concentrates, where the unanswered question becomes not a problem to be solved, but a force that propels the story forward, demanding attention, reflection, and patience. Part 2, then, does not resolve the mysteries introduced earlier, nor does it escalate them into spectacle. Instead, it deepens them, embedding them within broader patterns of thought and inquiry, and in doing so it prepares the ground for what comes next, a further descent into the interplay between evidence and belief, observation and interpretation, certainty and doubt, reminding us that the proof we seek may never arrive in the form we expect, and that learning to live with that possibility may be one of the most challenging and necessary tasks of the modern mind. By the time the narrative reaches its third movement, something subtle but irreversible has already occurred, because the mysteries are no longer external curiosities observed at a safe analytical distance. They have begun to seep inward, altering the way perception itself is framed, and this is where the proof is out there shifts from documentation into something closer to existential inquiry, even if it never names that transition outright. The ISS UFO swarm, revisited yet again, is now less about identifying what the objects are and more about understanding why they provoke such persistent cognitive dissonance, because despite repeated attempts to neutralize the anomaly through familiar explanations, the footage continues to generate discomfort, and discomfort is rarely sustained unless it touches a deeper nerve. The episode introduces this unease through repetition, replaying segments of the swarm footage with incremental adjustments, enhanced contrast here, altered playback speed there, and with each pass the viewer becomes increasingly aware of how interpretation changes with context, how meaning is not embedded solely in the data, but emerges through the act of viewing, shaped by expectation, training, and emotional readiness. This is a dangerous realization for a culture built on the authority of images, because it implies that seeing is not believing, but negotiating, and negotiation leaves room for doubt. As a novelist, I am struck by how closely this mirrors the structure of memory, the way recollection is not a static archive but a dynamic process, rewritten each time it is accessed, and in this sense the swarm becomes less a physical phenomenon and more a psychological catalyst, exposing the instability of perception itself. The expert's language reflects this shift, becoming more tentative, more qualified, as if they sense that the question is slipping beyond a reach of instrumentation and into the murkier territory of interpretation, where consensus is fragile and authority is provisional. Meanwhile, the Yale Lake leaf undergoes a parallel transformation in the narrative, moving from object analysis to symbolic resonance, as the discussion broadens to include not only what the leaf might be, but what it represents within a cultural imagination that has long associated unusual natural forms with hidden histories, lost species, or forgotten epochs. The show resists overt mythologizing, yet it cannot entirely suppress the associative power of the image, a massive leaf-like structure resting in dark water, evoking primordial forests, submerged worlds, and the uneasy possibility that remnants of the past persist alongside the present, unnoticed until chance brings them to light. This resonance is amplified by the reservoir's artificial origin, a reminder that human intervention often overlays older landscapes without erasing them, creating layered environments where time itself feels folded, and the discovery of the leaf seems to puncture the illusion of control that such engineered spaces provide. Experts debate whether the object could be the product of rare geological conditions or an extreme example of organic preservation, but the very need to stretch existing categories hints at their insufficiency, and this is where the narrative tension sharpens, because insufficiency threatens not just specific explanations, but the broader confidence in explanatory systems. The proof is out there handles this delicately, allowing the discomfort to surface without framing it as failure, instead presenting it as an honest encounter with complexity, and in doing so it aligns itself with a tradition of inquiry that values questions as much as answers. The juxtaposition of space and water, orbit and reservoir, begins to feel increasingly intentional, as if the episode is constructing a thematic corridor between the extremes of human exploration, suggesting that the unknown is not confined to distant frontiers, but permeates the environments we think we understand best. This realization carries a quiet destabilizing effect, because it undermines the comforting narrative of progress that positions mystery as something gradually receding before the advance of knowledge, replaced here by a vision of mystery as persistent, adaptive, and deeply embedded in the fabric of reality. The swarm and the leaf become mirrors held up to different aspects of the same epistemic challenge, one technological, one natural, both resistant to closure. As Part 3 unfolds, the show introduces voices that reflect on historical precedents, moments when scientific paradigms were forced to expand in response to anomalies that could not be ignored, and while these references are cautious, they plant a seed of possibility, the idea that today's unresolved cases may be tomorrow's catalysts for conceptual change. This suggestion is never made explicit, perhaps because to do so would risk tipping into speculation, but its presence is felt in the careful pacing, the way the narrative slows to allow contemplation rather than rushing toward resolution. From a literary standpoint, this is the point where the story's thematic depth becomes unmistakable, because it is no longer asking what these phenomena are, but what they demand of us as observers, how they challenge our tolerance for ambiguity, and our willingness to revise deeply held assumptions. The ISS footage, in particular, raises uncomfortable questions about surveillance and visibility, about what it means to watch and be watched in an era where observation is both omnipresent and selectively curated, and whether anomalies are overlooked not because they are invisible, but because they do not fit the narratives we are prepared to accept. The Yale Lake leaf, conversely, invites reflection on the limits of classification in the natural sciences, on the possibility that our taxonomies are provisional maps rather than exhaustive inventories, and that nature may continue to produce forms that confound our expectations. Together, these strands weave a quiet but insistent argument for epistemic openness, a stance that acknowledges the power of scientific method while recognizing its boundaries, and this balance is perhaps the most compelling aspect of the episode's storytelling. As the narrative approaches the end of Part 3, there is a sense of deepening rather than narrowing, an awareness that the questions raised are branching outward, intersecting with philosophy, history, and even ethics, because how we respond to the unknown shapes not only our understanding of the world, but our place within it. The proof is out there does not provide a roadmap for navigating this terrain, but it offers something arguably more valuable, a demonstration of inquiry conducted without arrogance, curiosity tempered by restraint, and wonder allowed to coexist with skepticism. For the novelist, this is fertile ground, because it mirrors the structure of compelling fiction, where meaning emerges not from definitive answers, but from sustained engagement with uncertainty, and where the journey itself becomes the point. Part 3 thus stands as a turning inward, a moment when the external mysteries prompt internal reckoning, preparing the narrative for a deeper exploration of belief, evidence, and the fragile human desire for certainty in a world that persistently refuses to be fully known. As the narrative advances into its fourth phase, a subtle recalibration takes place, not in the evidence itself, but in the emotional posture of those engaging with it, because prolonged exposure to unresolved phenomena has a way of reshaping expectations, dulling the initial shock while sharpening a more enduring, reflective unease. And the proof is out there captures this transition with an almost documentary patience that feels less like television pacing and more like lived time. The ISS UFO swarm, once shocking in its sudden appearance, now becomes a recurring presence, a visual refrain that returns with variations, each reappearance slightly altering the interpretive landscape, as if the footage itself were learning how to be seen, and this repetition erodes the comfort of novelty, replacing it with something more demanding, a requirement to sit with ambiguity rather than react to it. Analysts begin to speak less about what the objects might be and more about what they are not, ruling out explanations with increasing specificity, and while this process narrows the field, it does not converge on a satisfying endpoint, instead revealing the negative space of knowledge, the outline of understanding defined by absence rather than presence. This negative space becomes narratively significant because it invites speculation without endorsing it, allowing the viewer to feel the pull of unanswered questions without being pushed toward premature conclusions. From a novelist's perspective, this is a powerful technique, one that mirrors the way unresolved threads in long-form fiction accumulate meaning precisely because they remain open, exerting pressure across the narrative rather than collapsing into resolution. Parallel to this, the Yale Lake Leaf inquiry shifts from classification to context, exploring not only the object's material properties, but the environmental and historical conditions that might have given rise to it, and in doing so the show gestures toward a deeper temporal dimension, one that stretches beyond human observation and into geological and biological timescales that dwarf our everyday sense of duration. The leaf, massive and eerily detailed, becomes a portal into deep time, a reminder that the landscapes we inhabit are palimpsests, written and rewritten by forces that operate on scales we can barely comprehend, and this realization reframes the mystery from an isolated curiosity into a symptom of a larger, ongoing process of natural complexity. Experts discuss sedimentation, mineralization, and rare preservation pathways, their language precise yet tinged with uncertainty, and this blend of rigor and humility underscores a recurring theme of the episode, that knowledge advances not through certainty alone, but through a disciplined willingness to acknowledge what remains unknown. The juxtaposition of orbital footage and submerged artifact continues to resonate, now less as a contrast and more as a dialogue between extremes, suggesting that the unknown does not respect the boundaries we draw between disciplines, environments, or scales. As the narrative deepens, the show begins to explore the social life of anomalies, how footage and images circulate beyond expert circles into public discourse, where they acquire new meanings shaped by cultural anxieties, hopes, and narratives that often predate the evidence itself. The ISS UFO swarm, released into the wilds of the internet, becomes a canvas onto which fears of surveillance, invasion, and cosmic insignificance are projected, while the Yale Lake Leaf attracts interpretations rooted in lost civilizations, ancient ecosystems, or hidden dimensions of nature, and the proof is out there navigates this terrain carefully, neither endorsing nor dismissing these interpretations outright, but acknowledging their existence as part of the phenomenon's impact. This acknowledgement is crucial because it recognizes that anomalies are not just physical events but social catalysts, generating discourse that reveals as much about human psychology as it does about the objects in question. From a literary standpoint, this is where the story acquires a meta-narrative layer, reflecting on how stories are made, circulated, and transformed, and how meaning emerges not solely from facts, but from the interplay between evidence and imagination. The show's restraint in handling this interplay is notable, resisting the urge to dramatize or sensationalize, instead allowing the viewer to observe the process of meaning-making itself, with all its tensions and contradictions. As Part 4 progresses, the focus subtly shifts toward the ethics of interpretation, raising questions about responsibility in an age where images can be amplified and distorted with unprecedented speed, and where the line between inquiry and belief can blur dangerously. The expert's cautious language stands in contrast to the more definitive claims circulating online, highlighting a gap between professional skepticism and popular speculation, and this gap becomes a narrative fault line, one that underscores the importance of methodological rigor without dismissing the emotional resonance that drives public interest. The ISS footage, scrutinized yet again, reveals no decisive breakthrough, but the very absence of resolution becomes a statement, challenging the expectation that every mystery must yield to analysis within a finite time frame. Similarly, The Yale Lake leaf remains stubbornly resistant to definitive classification, its origins obscured by the complex interplay of natural processes that defy simple explanation, and this shared resistance begins to feel less like an obstacle and more like a defining feature of the story. The proof is out there seems increasingly comfortable inhabiting this space, allowing uncertainty to persist without apology, and in doing so it invites the viewer to reconsider their own relationship to the unknown, to ask whether the desire for closure sometimes limits rather than expands understanding. As the episode's fourth segment draws toward its close, the narrative energy does not dissipate, but rather settles into a deeper register, one characterized by sustained attention rather than escalating drama, and this tonal choice reinforces the idea that true engagement with mystery is a long-term commitment, not a momentary thrill. For the novelist, this section feels like a deepening of character, not of individuals, but of the inquiry itself, as the process of investigation acquires a personality defined by patience, humility, and a refusal to oversimplify. The swarm and the leaf, now familiar yet no less enigmatic, continue to exert their quiet influence, shaping the contours of the narrative and reminding us that the world we inhabit is layered with phenomena that resist easy understanding, phenomena that invite us not to conquer them with explanation, but to coexist with them in a state of informed curiosity. Part 4 thus becomes a meditation on endurance, on the capacity to remain engaged with questions that do not resolve quickly, and on the value of maintaining intellectual openness in the face of persistent uncertainty, setting the stage for a further exploration of how belief, evidence, and narrative intertwine as the story moves forward into even more challenging territory. By the fifth turn of the narrative, the investigation has acquired a weight that is no longer carried solely by the phenomena themselves, but by the cumulative effect of prolonged attention, because sustained scrutiny alters not only what is seen, but how seeing itself is experienced, and the proof is out there begins to reveal this transformation in subtle but unmistakable ways. The ISS UFO swarm, once treated as an isolated anomaly, now exists within a dense web of comparative cases, sensor limitations, and historical analogs, and this contextual saturation produces a strange dual effect, simultaneously normalizing the presence of the unexplained while deepening its unsettling implications. Analysts speak with greater fluency about uncertainty, their vocabulary enriched by repetition, yet this fluency does not bring comfort, because familiarity has not yielded mastery, and the swarm remains stubbornly resistant to narrative closure. Instead, what becomes increasingly clear is that the real story is unfolding not in the object's trajectories, but in the human response to them, in the way institutions manage ambiguity and individuals negotiate belief, when evidence refuses to settle into clear categories. The episode leans into this tension by examining how data from the ISS is curated, archived, and made accessible, revealing layers of mediation that stand between raw observation and public interpretation, and in doing so it invites an uncomfortable question. How many anomalies pass unnoticed not because they are invisible, but because they are filtered out by systems designed to prioritize the expected? This question lingers like a low-frequency hum beneath the analysis, never stated outright, yet impossible to ignore once perceived. Meanwhile, the Yale Lake leaf investigation enters a more speculative phase, not in the sense of ungrounded conjecture, but in the careful exploration of edge cases, rare processes, and unlikely convergences that might account for such an object, and this exploration highlights a recurring theme of the series, the idea that nature often operates in extremes that fall outside our statistical comfort zones. The leaf becomes a focal point for discussions about probability, about how rarity is often mistaken for impossibility, and how scientific models, while powerful, are calibrated to typical conditions rather than exceptional ones. This recalibration of perspective does not solve the mystery, but it reframes it, shifting the emphasis from "what is it?" to "how do we think about things that fall outside our expectations?" And this shift resonates deeply with the ongoing analysis of the swarm, where similar questions arise about the limits of existing frameworks. As the narrative deepens, the show begins to examine the psychological toll of unresolved inquiry, the subtle fatigue that accompanies sustained uncertainty, and the strategies individuals and institutions use to cope with it, whether through compartmentalization, humor, or the quiet deferral of judgment. There is a moment in the episode where an expert pauses, choosing words with visible care, and in that pause the viewer glimpses the human cost of intellectual honesty, the effort required to say, "I don't know," in a culture that often equates authority with certainty. This moment, understated yet profound, encapsulates the ethical core of The Proof is Out There, which consistently privileges integrity over spectacle and patience over premature conclusion. The ISS footage, replayed yet again, offers no new revelation, but its persistence becomes a narrative statement in itself, a reminder that some questions demand endurance rather than ingenuity, and that the act of continued observation is a form of respect for the complexity of the world. The Yale Lake leaf, examined through increasingly sophisticated lenses, likewise resists definitive explanation, its surface textures and internal structure hinting at processes both familiar and alien, and this duality reinforces the episode's central motif that the unknown often wears the mask of the known, inviting misinterpretation as much as insight. As Part 5 unfolds, the parallel arcs of sky and water begin to converge conceptually, suggesting that the boundaries we draw between domains of inquiry are more porous than we like to admit, and that a truly comprehensive understanding of anomalies requires a willingness to think across disciplines, scales, and assumptions. This convergence is not framed as a solution but as an orientation, a way of approaching mystery that values connection over categorization, and this orientation feels increasingly urgent in a world saturated with information, yet hungry for meaning. The show's restrained tone allows these ideas to surface organically, without didacticism, trusting the viewer to sense the implications without being led by the hand. From a novelist's vantage point, this section of the narrative functions as a deepening of thematic resonance, where the mysteries serve as catalysts for reflection rather than puzzles to be solved, and where the true drama lies in the negotiation between curiosity and restraint. The swarm and the leaf, still unresolved, now feel less like problems awaiting solutions and more like companions on an intellectual journey, markers of a reality that exceeds our current maps. As the episode moves toward its latter half, the viewer is invited to consider whether the desire for proof, so central to the show's title, might itself be a double-edged impulse, capable of driving discovery, but also of narrowing vision when wielded without humility. Part 5 does not answer this question, nor does it attempt to, but it sharpens it, leaving it suspended in the mind like an unresolved chord, resonant and demanding attention, setting the stage for further exploration of belief, evidence, and the delicate balance between knowing and not knowing that defines our engagement with the unknown. By the sixth movement, the investigation has reached a psychological inflection point, a phase where repetition no longer merely reinforces uncertainty, but begins to transform it into a kind of background condition, an ambient state in which mystery is no longer an interruption but a constant presence, and The Proof is Out There reflects this shift with a tone that grows quieter, more contemplative, as though the narrative itself has learned to lower its voice in the presence of what it cannot resolve. The ISS UFO swarm, now thoroughly dissected in terms of motion vectors, relative positioning, and sensor artifacts, resists every attempt to be reduced to a single explanatory narrative, and this resistance forces the inquiry to pivot inward, toward the assumptions embedded in the tools and models used to interpret such data. Analysts begin to speak about the limitations of perspective imposed by orbital cameras, about parallax errors, frame rates, and compression artifacts, yet even as these technical caveats accumulate, they fail to fully account for the coordinated behavior that initially drew attention to the footage, and this gap between explanation and observation becomes increasingly conspicuous. What emerges instead is a recognition that modern systems of observation, for all their sophistication, are designed with specific expectations in mind, and when phenomena fall outside those expectations, the systems struggle not only to classify them but even to register them as meaningful anomalies. This realization introduces a subtle critique of technological confidence, suggesting that the very precision of our instruments may blind us to forms of complexity they were never intended to capture. The narrative does not frame this as a flaw to be corrected so much as a condition to be acknowledged, an inherent trade-off in any attempt to model a world that exceeds our conceptual reach. Meanwhile, the Yale Lake Leaf inquiry deepens along a different axis, turning toward the question of interpretation itself, as experts debate whether the object's resemblance to a leaf is intrinsic or projected, a product of pareidolia amplified by scale and context. This debate is not trivial because it touches on the human tendency to recognize familiar patterns in ambiguous forms, a tendency that has evolutionary roots and profound implications for scientific inquiry. The show navigates this terrain with care, acknowledging the validity of cognitive bias, while resisting the temptation to dismiss the object outright, and in doing so it highlights a delicate balance between skepticism and openness that lies at the heart of responsible investigation. The leaf structure, examined in greater detail, reveals complexities that defy simple categorization, textures that suggest organic processes, yet lack definitive markers of known species, and this ambiguity sustains the mystery even as it refines it. As Part 6 unfolds, the parallel narratives of Swarm and Leaf begin to feel less like separate case studies and more like variations on a single theme, the challenge of interpreting phenomena that occupy the liminal space between categories, neither fully explicable nor wholly inexplicable. This thematic convergence is reinforced by the show's pacing, which allows moments of silence and hesitation to linger, signaling that not every gap in knowledge can or should be immediately filled. From a literary perspective, this restraint is significant because it resists the narrative impulse toward escalation, choosing instead to explore depth, to dwell in the texture of uncertainty rather than racing toward resolution. The experts' conversations reflect this shift, becoming more reflective, less focused on definitive answers, and more on the process of inquiry itself, and this meta-awareness lends the episode a philosophical dimension that extends beyond the specifics of the cases at hand. The ISS footage, now familiar in its strangeness, prompts questions about observation and intent, about whether coordinated movement necessarily implies intelligence, and about the thresholds at which human observers are willing to entertain such implications, even hypothetically. These questions are posed not as invitations to belief, but as exercises in conceptual flexibility, challenging viewers to examine the assumptions that govern their interpretations of complex systems. Similarly, the Yale Lake Leaf prompts reflection on the boundaries between natural history and narrative, on how objects acquire meaning through the stories told about them, and on the responsibility that comes with that storytelling power. As the episode progresses, there is a growing sense that the true subject of the proof is out there as not anomalous phenomena per se, but the human relationship to uncertainty, the strategies we employ to manage it, and the ways it reshapes our understanding of knowledge itself. Part 6 embodies this realization, functioning as a quiet turning point where the investigation becomes self-aware, conscious of its own limitations and possibilities. The mysteries remain unresolved, yet they no longer feel like obstacles to understanding. Instead, they become frameworks within which deeper questions can be explored, questions about perception, bias, and the ethics of interpretation. As the narrative draws this section to a close, the viewer is left with a sense of intellectual suspension, not frustration but attentiveness, an awareness that the absence of answers can be as informative as their presence. For the novelist, this is a moment of profound narrative maturity, where the story trusts its audience to engage with complexity without the promise of closure, and where mystery is allowed to exist not as a problem to be solved, but as a condition to be lived with, setting the stage for the next phase of inquiry, where belief, doubt, and meaning will be examined with even greater intensity. Part 7 opens in a quieter register, not because the mysteries have diminished, but because they have settled into the mental furniture of the investigation, becoming ever-present rather than intrusive, and this shift marks a new phase in which attention turns decisively toward belief. Not belief as conviction, but belief as a fluid, adaptive process that evolves in response to sustained uncertainty. The ISS UFO swarm, now almost ritualistically revisited, has ceased to shock, yet it continues to unsettle, precisely because its persistence undermines the comforting assumption that repeated analysis must eventually yield clarity, and instead it offers a lesson in epistemic humility, demonstrating how even the most advanced observational platforms can encounter phenomena that resist assimilation into existing explanatory models. The experts' discussions increasingly revolve around thresholds. At what point coordinated motion becomes statistically significant? At what point improbability demands reconsideration rather than dismissal? And these thresholds are revealed to be less objective than often assumed, shaped by disciplinary norms, institutional caution, and deeply ingrained narratives about what kinds of entities are allowed to exist in certain domains. This realization does not lead the episode into speculation, but it does deepen its philosophical undertow, inviting the viewer to consider how knowledge is socially negotiated and how the boundaries of the plausible are drawn and redrawn over time. The swarm, in this light, becomes a stress test for collective rationality, probing the limits of consensus in the face of persistent anomaly, and the show's refusal to resolve it feels increasingly intentional, a deliberate choice to foreground process over outcome. Parallel to this, the Yale Lake Leaf narrative takes on a more introspective tone, as the object's stubborn ambiguity prompts reflection on the human impulse to narrativize nature, to impose story structures on forms that may have none, and to derive meaning from resemblance, even when resemblance may be coincidental. Experts speak openly about the seductive power of metaphor, about how calling the object a leaf frames interpretation in ways that may illuminate or obscure, and this linguistic self-awareness adds another layer to the inquiry, revealing how language itself participates in the construction of mystery. The leaf's material analysis continues, but it is now accompanied by an examination of cognitive framing, an acknowledgement that how we describe an object can shape the questions we ask about it, and therefore the answers we are able to imagine. As Part 7 unfolds, the two investigations begin to intersect more explicitly through this shared concern with interpretation, with how observation is filtered through expectation, and with how anomalies challenge not only empirical models, but also narrative habits. The Proof is Out There uses this convergence to explore a deeper tension between skepticism and openness, suggesting that while skepticism guards against error, it can also harden into dogma if not tempered by curiosity, and that openness, while essential for discovery, carries the risk of overinterpretation if not disciplined by method. The episode does not resolve this tension, nor does it offer a formula for balancing these impulses, but it dramatizes their coexistence, showing how responsible inquiry requires navigating between them without collapsing into either credulity or dismissal. The ISS footage, when viewed through this lens, becomes less a question of extraterrestrial presence and more a meditation on coordinated systems, on how complex behaviors can emerge from simple rules, and on the challenge of distinguishing intentionality from emergent pattern, a challenge that resonates far beyond the realm of UFOs, touching fields as diverse as ecology, economics, and artificial intelligence. Similarly, the Yale Lake Leaf invites consideration of emergent form in natural systems, of how geological and biological processes can conspire to produce structures that appear purposeful without having been designed, and this parallel further reinforces the episode's thematic cohesion. As the narrative progresses, there is an increasing sense that the show is less concerned with solving these particular mysteries than with cultivating a mode of attention capable of engaging with complexity without panic or premature closure. This cultivation is subtle, achieved through pacing, through the repetition of careful language, and through the visible restraint of the experts, whose willingness to remain uncertain becomes a quiet ethical stance. From a novelist's perspective, this section of the story feels like a deepening of character, not of individuals, but of inquiry itself, as the investigation acquires a moral dimension, defined by patience, honesty, and respect for the unknown. The swarm and the leaf, now familiar companions in this journey, no longer demand immediate answers. Instead, they ask something more challenging, that we examine our own thresholds for uncertainty, our comfort with ambiguity, and our readiness to revise the stories we tell about the world. As Part 7 draws toward its end, the viewer is left with a sense of suspended engagement, a feeling that the questions raised are not meant to be resolved within the confines of a single episode or even a single series, but are part of an ongoing conversation about knowledge, belief, and the limits of human understanding. The Proof is Out There in this moment, feels less like a program and more like a practice, an invitation to cultivate a way of seeing that is alert, critical, and humble, aware that the universe may always contain elements that elude our grasp, and that our task is not to eliminate mystery, but to learn how to live thoughtfully in its presence. Part 8 unfolds with a widening of scope that feels both inevitable and unsettling, as the inquiry moves beyond the confines of individual cases and begins to interrogate the cultural ecosystems in which such mysteries circulate, revealing how anomalies acquire momentum not merely through evidence, but through repetition, attention, and the deep human need to situate the unknown within shared narratives. The ISS UFO swarm, by now a familiar apparition, has entered a phase of collective interpretation where its meaning is no longer negotiated solely among experts, but is shaped by a diffuse public consciousness, a vast, decentralized audience that brings its own assumptions, fears, and hopes to the footage, transforming it from data into symbol. The Proof is Out There acknowledges this transformation without surrendering to it, tracing how images migrate across platforms, accumulating commentary and conjecture, and in doing so it exposes the mechanics of modern mythmaking, where uncertainty becomes a catalyst for storytelling rather than a barrier to it. The swarm's repeated circulation amplifies its ambiguity, because each viewing is framed by the echoes of previous interpretations, and this layering of meaning creates a feedback loop in which the phenomenon feels increasingly significant regardless of whether new evidence emerges. From a novelist's standpoint, this process is deeply familiar, mirroring the way legends grow through retelling, each iteration adding texture and resonance, even as the core remains elusive. The episode uses this dynamic to raise a subtle but profound question about authority in the age of ubiquitous media, asking who gets to decide what an anomaly means when interpretation is no longer centralized, and how expertise functions when it must compete with the persuasive power of narrative. Parallel to this, the Yale Lake leaf begins to attract its own interpretive halo, as images of the object circulate and inspire speculation that ranges from the rigorously scientific to the openly fantastical, and The Proof is Out There navigates this spectrum with characteristic restraint, neither endorsing nor mocking the more speculative claims, but situating them within a broader context of human pattern-seeking behavior. The leaf's resemblance to a familiar form proves irresistible, and the show uses this to explore how analogy operates as a cognitive bridge, allowing people to engage with the unknown by anchoring it to the known, even when that anchoring risks distortion. Experts discuss the dangers and benefits of such analogical thinking, acknowledging that while it can mislead, it also serves as a starting point for inquiry, a way of generating hypotheses that can later be tested or discarded. This nuanced treatment underscores a recurring theme of the series, that error is not the enemy of knowledge, so long as it remains corrigible, and that the greater danger lies in closing off inquiry altogether. As Part 8 progresses, the narrative turns toward the emotional dimensions of uncertainty, examining how prolonged exposure to unresolved questions can produce not only curiosity but also anxiety, fascination, and, in some cases, a longing for definitive answers that borders on desperation. The ISS swarm becomes a focal point for these emotions, its silent choreography against the void of space, inviting interpretations that speak less to the objects themselves than to the viewer's relationship with the cosmos, their sense of vulnerability and wonder in the face of vastness. The Yale Lake leaf, grounded yet enigmatic, evokes a different but related emotional response, a sense of hidden depth beneath familiar surfaces, suggesting that even the landscapes we think we know may harbor secrets that resist easy disclosure. The show's strength lies in its ability to hold these emotional currents without being swept away by them, maintaining a tone of measured inquiry that neither inflames fear nor extinguishes wonder. From a literary perspective, this balance is crucial because it allows the narrative to function as a space for reflection rather than persuasion, inviting the audience to sit with their reactions and examine them rather than rushing toward belief or disbelief. The episode also begins to gesture toward the ethical implications of anomaly-driven narratives, questioning how responsibility should be exercised when presenting unresolved phenomena to a public hungry for meaning, and how to avoid the twin pitfalls of sensationalism and dismissal. The Proof is Out There models one possible approach through its careful pacing, its insistence on context, and its refusal to promise resolution where none exists, and this approach itself becomes part of the story, an example of how inquiry can be conducted with integrity in a media landscape that often rewards certainty over honesty. As Part 8 nears its conclusion, the swarm and the leaf feel less like isolated cases and more like nodes in a larger network of questions about perception, interpretation, and the social life of mystery, questions that extend beyond the specifics of these phenomena and into the heart of how contemporary societies negotiate the boundaries of knowledge. The narrative does not attempt to answer these questions, but it sharpens them, leaving the viewer with a heightened awareness of the forces that shape understanding in an age of constant observation and commentary. For the novelist, this section represents a broadening of thematic horizon, where the mysteries serve as lenses through which to examine not only the unknown itself, but the human systems that respond to it, revealing a complex interplay between evidence, narrative, and emotion that ensures the story remains alive precisely because it remains unresolved. Part 9 marks a transition from collective interpretation to personal reckoning, a phase in which the accumulated weight of unresolved evidence begins to register not only as an intellectual challenge, but as an intimate disturbance, subtly altering how individuals relate to certainty in their everyday lives. And the proof is out there captures this shift by allowing the camera to linger on moments of hesitation, reflection, and quiet recalibration among those engaged in the investigation. The ISS UFO swarm, now deeply embedded in the narrative, has ceased to function merely as footage to be decoded and has instead become a reference point, a recurring reminder that some phenomena persist beyond explanation and continue to shape thought through their very resistance to closure. Analysts speak less frequently now, and when they do, their words carry a reflective quality, as though they are aware that each statement contributes not to resolution but to an evolving relationship with the unknown. The focus turns toward the impact of sustained ambiguity, toward how repeated encounters with unanswered questions can erode the illusion of mastery that often accompanies technical expertise, replacing it with a more provisional sense of understanding grounded in probability rather than certainty. This erosion is not portrayed as a loss, but as a maturation, a movement toward a more honest engagement with complexity, and the episode treats it with respect, acknowledging the courage required to remain open in the absence of definitive answers. The swarm's coordinated movements, still unexplained, now prompt broader reflections on pattern recognition, on the thresholds at which the human mind shifts from seeing randomness to perceiving structure, and on the implications of that shift for fields far removed from aerospace analysis. The show subtly suggests that these cognitive processes are universal, shaping how we interpret everything from market fluctuations to social behavior, and that anomalies like the swarm serve as concentrated sites where these processes become visible. In parallel, the Yale Lake Leaf narrative takes on a more introspective tone, as the object's ambiguity becomes a mirror for the investigator's own assumptions about natural order and classification. The leaf's stubborn resistance to neat categorization prompts discussions about the provisional nature of scientific naming, about how categories are tools rather than truths, and about the risks of mistaking those tools for the reality they are meant to describe. This recognition introduces a gentle but persistent skepticism toward rigid taxonomies, encouraging a view of nature as a continuum rather than a collection of discrete boxes, and this perspective resonates deeply with the ongoing analysis of the swarm, where similar issues of categorization and boundary drawing are at play. As Part 9 unfolds, the narrative begins to explore the emotional strategies individuals use to coexist with uncertainty, revealing a spectrum that ranges from quiet acceptance to restless speculation, and the proof is out there observes these strategies without judgment, presenting them as natural responses to a world that resists complete comprehension. The ISS footage, now almost meditative in its repetition, invites a kind of contemplative viewing, where the absence of answers becomes a space for reflection rather than frustration, and this shift in engagement marks a significant evolution in the narrative's tone. The Yale Lake Leaf, grounded yet enigmatic, elicits a similar response, its presence in the story less a problem to be solved than a reminder of depth, of layers beneath the surface that remain inaccessible despite our best efforts. From a novelist's perspective, this section of the story feels like a deepening of interiority, where the external mysteries catalyze internal change, prompting characters, both on-screen and implied, to reconsider their relationship with knowledge itself. The episode's pacing reinforces this inward turn, slowing the rhythm of analysis and allowing space for silence, as though acknowledging that some insights emerge only when the demand for answers is temporarily suspended. The proof is out there, in this moment, seems to suggest that the true cost of unresolved mystery is not confusion but transformation, a gradual reshaping of expectations and beliefs that unfolds over time. As Part 9 draws toward its conclusion, the swarm and the leaf stand not as isolated curiosities, but as enduring presences, companions in an ongoing dialogue between certainty and doubt, and the viewer is invited to consider how many similar presences populate their own understanding of the world, quietly influencing perception without ever announcing themselves. The narrative does not resolve these questions, nor does it attempt to, but it leaves the viewer with a heightened sensitivity to ambiguity, an awareness that knowledge is always provisional, always subject to revision in the light of new evidence or new ways of seeing. In this sense, Part 9 functions as a reflective pause, a moment of consolidation where the implications of prolonged uncertainty are allowed to settle, preparing the ground for the next stage of inquiry, where the focus will shift once again, not toward resolution, but toward the enduring significance of questions that refuse to disappear. Part 10 emerges as a phase of synthesis, not in the sense of resolution, but in the weaving together of threads that have been running parallel since the beginning, as the investigation begins to acknowledge that meaning does not always arise from answers, but from the relationships formed between questions, contexts, and observers over time. The ISS UFO swarm, by now an almost iconic presence within the narrative, is treated less as an object of fixation and more as a reference structure, a recurring coordinate around which discussions of uncertainty, observation, and interpretation orbit. The footage is no longer introduced with anticipation but with familiarity, and this familiarity alters its impact, shifting the emphasis from shock to persistence, from novelty to endurance, as though the swarm's true significance lies not in what it might be, but in how long it has remained resistant to definitive explanation. Analysts reflect openly on this persistence, acknowledging that the absence of closure has itself become data, a signal that the phenomenon occupies a boundary zone where existing frameworks falter. This admission marks a subtle but important shift in tone, as the inquiry moves from problem-solving to sense-making, from the pursuit of definitive answers to the cultivation of contextual understanding. In parallel, the Yale Lake Leaf narrative reaches a similar inflection point, as the object's ambiguity is no longer treated as a temporary obstacle, but as an enduring feature that demands a different mode of engagement. Experts speak less about pinning down a precise origin and more about mapping the range of plausible processes that could have produced such a form, and this shift reflects a broader philosophical orientation, one that values explanatory breadth over narrow certainty. The leaf becomes a case study in complexity, a reminder that natural phenomena often emerge from the convergence of multiple factors rather than a single cause, and that insisting on singular explanations can obscure rather than clarify. As Part 10 unfolds, the show begins to explicitly explore the idea that anomalies function as mirrors, reflecting back the assumptions, values, and limitations of those who study them, and this reflexive turn adds a new layer of depth to the narrative. The ISS swarm, viewed through this lens, reveals not only gaps in aerospace analysis but also cultural expectations about the cosmos, about what kinds of entities are permitted to exist in space, and what kinds of movements are deemed acceptable or plausible. The Yale Lake Leaf similarly reflects assumptions about Earth's history, about the completeness of our understanding of biological and geological processes, and about the stability of categories that organize natural knowledge. By placing these reflections side by side, the proof is out there suggests that the unknown is not an external adversary to be conquered, but a collaborator in the ongoing project of understanding, challenging us to refine our tools, language, and expectations. From a novelist's perspective, this is where the narrative achieves a kind of thematic coherence, as the disparate elements introduced earlier begin to resonate with one another, forming a network of meaning that extends beyond the specifics of any single case. The pacing reinforces this coherence, allowing ideas to unfold gradually, without the pressure of imminent revelation, and in doing so it invites a more contemplative mode of viewing, one that values depth over drama. The episode also touches on the temporal dimension of inquiry, acknowledging that some questions may require not just new data, but new generations of thinkers, new technologies, and new conceptual frameworks to be adequately addressed. This acknowledgement carries a quiet humility, recognizing that the limits encountered today are not necessarily permanent, but neither are they trivial, and that patience is an integral component of honest investigation. As Part 10 progresses, the emotional tone becomes steadier, less reactive, as though the narrative has found a sustainable rhythm for coexisting with uncertainty, and this steadiness feels earned, the result of prolonged engagement rather than resignation. The swarm and the leaf, still unresolved, now function as anchors, grounding the discussion in concrete cases even as the implications expand outward into philosophy, epistemology, and ethics. The Proof is Out There does not claim that every mystery must eventually be solved, nor does it suggest that mystery should be romanticized for its own sake. Instead, it occupies a middle ground, advocating for a disciplined openness that respects both the power and the limits of human understanding. As this part draws to a close, the viewer is left with a sense of integration, an awareness that the questions raised throughout the narrative are interconnected, and that grappling with them requires not just technical expertise, but reflective awareness of how knowledge is constructed and revised. Part 10 thus serves as a quiet consolidation, gathering the insights accumulated so far and preparing the ground for the final stages of the journey, where the focus will shift once more, not toward definitive answers, but toward the enduring significance of inquiry itself and the ways in which living with unanswered questions can reshape our relationship with the world. Part 11 unfolds with a deliberate quietness, as if the narrative itself has learned to lower its voice in the presence of questions that no longer respond to urgency, and this tonal restraint becomes one of its most striking qualities, signaling that the investigation has reached a stage where listening is more important than asserting. The ISS UFO swarm returns once again, not as a breaking development or a dramatic escalation, but as a familiar enigma whose contours are now deeply etched into the collective consciousness of the investigators, and this familiarity allows for a more nuanced engagement, one that considers not just what the objects might be, but what their continued appearance has done to the discourse surrounding unexplained phenomena. Analysts note that the swarm has generated an unusually rich archive of secondary material, frame-by-frame breakdowns, simulations, theoretical papers, public debates, and even artistic interpretations, all orbiting around the same few seconds of footage, and this accumulation itself becomes a subject of analysis. The phenomenon has effectively created a microecosystem of interpretation, a self-sustaining loop in which the unknown feeds curiosity, curiosity feeds analysis, and analysis feeds further questions, and the show begins to ask whether this recursive process might be one of the defining features of modern encounters with the unexplained. Rather than existing as isolated mysteries, anomalies like the ISS swarm now live extended lives within digital culture, continuously reinterpreted as new tools and perspectives emerge, and Part 11 treats this as neither inherently positive nor negative, but as a reality that shapes how meaning is produced in the contemporary world. In parallel, the Yale Lake Leaf narrative deepens its exploration of time, both geological and human, situating the object within a temporal scale that dwarfs individual lifespans and even recorded history, and this temporal expansion subtly reframes the stakes of the investigation. What does it mean, the narrative asks, to demand immediate answers from phenomena that may be the product of processes unfolding over thousands or millions of years? The Leaf, examined once more under different analytical techniques, resists definitive classification, but instead of framing this resistance as failure, the show presents it as an invitation to reconsider the expectations placed on scientific inquiry in a culture accustomed to rapid results. Experts speak candidly about the pressures of funding cycles, media attention, and public demand, acknowledging that these forces can distort the natural rhythms of research, pushing investigators toward premature conclusions or overly confident statements. This candidness lends Part 11 a reflective, almost confessional quality as the narrative momentarily turns inward, examining not just the mysteries themselves, but the structures that govern how those mysteries are approached. The ISS swarm, in this context, becomes a case study in how institutional and cultural frameworks influence interpretation, as discussions touch on classification systems, reporting protocols, and the language used to describe anomalous observations, revealing how subtle choices in terminology can shape perception and debate. Words like object, artifact, anomaly, and phenomenon are unpacked, their implications examined, and the show suggests that language itself can act as both a bridge and a barrier to understanding. From a storytelling perspective, this focus on language and framing adds a meta-narrative layer, reminding the audience that every account of the unknown is mediated, filtered through human cognition, bias, and convention. The Yale Lake Leaf similarly exposes the power of narrative framing as competing stories about its origin coexist, each drawing selectively on evidence to construct a coherent account, and the show resists the temptation to crown a single narrative as dominant, instead highlighting the provisional nature of all such constructions. As Part 11 progresses, the emotional register shifts subtly, moving from curiosity to a kind of mature wonder, less exuberant but more resilient, grounded in the recognition that uncertainty is not a temporary inconvenience, but a permanent feature of engagement with the world. This recognition is reinforced by interviews with researchers who have spent decades working at the edges of the known, many of whom speak not of frustration, but of a deep, sustained fascination that has shaped their identities and careers. Their testimonies lend the episode a human texture, emphasizing that the pursuit of the unknown is not just an intellectual exercise, but a lived experience, one that involves patience, humility, and a willingness to dwell in ambiguity. The ISS UFO swarm, seen through their eyes, is less a puzzle to be solved than a companion on a long journey, a reminder of why they entered their fields in the first place. The Yale Lake Leaf, too, becomes a symbol of this journey, embodying the slow accumulation of insight rather than the flash of discovery, and the show draws a quiet parallel between these two cases, suggesting that they represent different expressions of the same underlying dynamic, the tension between human desire for closure and the world's indifference to that desire. Part 11 also touches on the ethical dimensions of inquiry, raising questions about responsibility, transparency, and the potential consequences of misinterpretation, particularly in an age where information spreads rapidly and misinformation can take on a life of its own. The narrative emphasizes the importance of restraint, of acknowledging uncertainty openly rather than filling gaps with speculation, and this emphasis feels especially resonant given the broader cultural context in which the show exists. By the time this part approaches its end, there is a palpable sense that the investigation has reached a kind of equilibrium, not because the mysteries have been solved, but because the narrative has found a way to coexist with them honestly. The swarm remains unresolved, the leaf remains enigmatic, but their unresolved nature no longer feels like a deficiency. Instead, it feels like an accurate reflection of a world that is larger, more complex, and more resistant to simplification than any single story can capture. Part 11 thus stands as a meditation on endurance, on the sustained effort required to engage meaningfully with the unknown, and on the quiet rewards of doing so without demanding certainty as the price of understanding. Part 12 arrives not as a conclusion in the traditional sense, but as a widening of perspective, a final outward breath after a long, careful inhalation, and the narrative treats this moment with a restraint that feels intentional, almost ethical, as if to impose a neat ending would betray the very principles the investigation has spent so long articulating. The ISS UFO swarm appears one last time, not through new footage or revelations, but through recontextualization, as analysts and commentators revisit the phenomenon with the accumulated weight of everything learned, questioned, and unlearned along the way, and this revisiting transforms the swarm into something akin to a landmark rather than a destination. It is spoken of as a reference event, a point in time when observation, technology, media, and public imagination intersected in a way that made uncertainty visible rather than hidden, and this visibility becomes its lasting legacy. The objects themselves, still unresolved, now feel almost secondary to the processes they set in motion. The debates they sparked, the methodologies they tested, and the introspection they forced upon institutions and individuals alike. In reflecting on this, the narrative underscores a central insight that has been quietly forming since the earliest parts, namely that the true impact of anomalous phenomena often lies not in what they are, but in how they alter the contours of inquiry, pushing disciplines to confront their blind spots and assumptions. The Yale Lake Leaf is brought into this reflective frame with equal care, its story expanded beyond the specifics of its form to encompass the broader implications of encountering material evidence that resists easy categorization. Experts speak less about the leaf as an isolated object and more about what it represents within the long arc of scientific engagement with the unknown, a reminder that nature does not organize itself according to human taxonomies, and that our systems of classification are provisional tools rather than final truths. The leaf's ambiguity is framed as productive, a catalyst for interdisciplinary dialogue that draws together geology, biology, climatology, and even philosophy, and this convergence is presented as one of the investigation's most valuable outcomes. As Part 12 unfolds, the narrative explicitly embraces the idea that unanswered questions can function as stabilizing forces rather than sources of chaos, providing fixed points around which knowledge can evolve without the illusion of completeness. This idea is illustrated through reflections on historical cases where premature certainty delayed progress, contrasted with moments where sustained uncertainty fostered innovation and deeper understanding. The ISS swarm, in this sense, joins a lineage of phenomena that have shaped scientific culture precisely by refusing to be neatly resolved, and the show places it alongside other enduring mysteries, not to elevate it to mythic status, but to situate it within a realistic history of inquiry marked by patience and revision. The emotional tone of Part 12 is notably calm, even gentle, as though the narrative has arrived at a place of acceptance, and this calmness invites the audience to reconsider their own relationship with the unknown, challenging the reflexive desire for closure that often accompanies stories of mystery. Rather than offering a final answer, the show offers a stance, a way of standing in relation to uncertainty that is neither fearful nor romantic, but grounded in curiosity and responsibility. This stance is reinforced by the voices of researchers who speak about the personal transformations wrought by long-term engagement with unresolved questions, describing how their understanding of success has shifted from producing definitive results to contributing incrementally to a shared, evolving body of knowledge. Their reflections lend the episode a quiet gravity, emphasizing that the pursuit of understanding is as much about character and disposition as it is about data and technique. The narrative also returns briefly to the role of the audience, acknowledging that public engagement with mysteries like the ISS swarm and the Yale Lake Leaf plays a significant role in shaping their trajectories, for better and worse, and it calls for a more reflective form of participation, one that values nuance over spectacle and patience over instant gratification. This call is not delivered as a lecture, but as an invitation, framed through the recognition that collective curiosity, when tempered by humility, can be a powerful force for learning. As the final moments of Part 12 unfold, the imagery and language subtly expand outward, moving from specific cases to a broader contemplation of humanity's place within a vast, complex universe that does not yield its secrets easily or all at once. The unknown is no longer portrayed as a frontier to be conquered, but as a constant companion, an ever-present reminder of the limits of perception and the possibilities that lie beyond them. In this closing movement, the proof is out there affirms that the value of investigation lies not solely in answers, but in the habits of thought it cultivates: careful observation, disciplined skepticism, openness to revision, and respect for complexity. The ISS UFO swarm and the Yale Lake Leaf, unresolved to the end, stand as enduring symbols of these habits, anchoring the narrative in concrete realities even as its implications stretch far beyond them. Part 12 thus completes the journey not by closing doors, but by leaving them deliberately ajar, suggesting that the end of this particular inquiry is also a beginning, a point from which new questions will emerge, shaped by the lessons learned along the way. The final impression is one of continuity rather than finality, a sense that the pursuit of understanding is an ongoing conversation between humanity and a world that is always slightly out of reach, and that this conversation, sustained with care and integrity, is itself a meaningful and worthwhile endeavor.